It was late October of 2008 in Sevier County, Tennessee, near the town of Kodiak. Late one evening, my oldest son called me on his cell phone. I was upstairs working on the computer, doing some research, while he was downstairs on the back porch smoking a cigarette. Judging by his tone, he was either very upset or excited about something. He told me, "You need to get out here right now and bring the spotlight and the shotgun with you." I immediately grabbed both items from my bedroom and rushed to the back porch. His eyes were as big as dinner plates, and he looked a bit pale. Now, my son was 18 at the time, and he had always been a calm kid. We used to go hunting together in the swamps north of Florida since he was just 4 years old. So for him to be this shaken, I knew something serious was up. When I got there, I asked, "What's up?" He pointed towards the sheds and said, "Point the light over there between the two sheds, at that oak tree." I did what he asked, but I couldn't see anything. He then said, "No, beside the oak tree." I aimed the light again, but still saw nothing. He started getting frustrated, grabbed my arm, and moved the spotlight to where he wanted it, saying, "Right there." As the light hit the spot, it revealed a massive upright figure standing behind the oak tree, trying to use the tree to block our view. The tree was about 4 feet in diameter and 30 yards from us, but it still wasn't big enough to hide this creature. It had long arms that reached almost to its knees, and it stood a little slouched with its knees slightly bent. It was covered in brownish red hair, maybe 2 to 3 inches long, all uniform in length except for its face, which looked kind of ape-like. Honestly, it reminded me of Harry from the movie Harry and the Hendersons. As the creature stood there, I moved the spotlight off to the right. When I did this, the creature half stepped away from behind the tree to see what we were doing. When I brought the beam back, it stepped back behind the tree. Again, I moved the light to the right, and again the animal half stepped to the right to peek at us. When I brought the light back, it hid behind the tree again. It was almost like a game of peekaboo. Finding it somewhat amusing, I turned off the spotlight for a few seconds and then pointed it directly at the tree and turned it back on. The beam revealed the creature standing to the right of the tree, facing us squarely. It looked a little surprised and squinted at the bright light before quickly moving back behind the tree. This time, it retreated through the woods, using the tree to block our view as it left. Once we could no longer hear it crashing through the brush, my son and I stood there in amazement, shaking from what we had just seen. Finally, I managed to smile and said, "Holy crap, dude, we just saw a Sasquatch." My son looked at me and replied, "That was freaking awesome." We went back inside and talked about it for quite a while before heading off to bed. The next morning, I went out to look for tracks where we had seen our late night visitor. Here in eastern Tennessee, the soil is mostly clay, which isn't great for tracking, but I still managed to find 2 footprints behind the oak tree. They measured just under 17 inches in length and about 6 inches wide across the ball of the foot. There was another print in some leaves to the right of the tree, but it wasn't clear enough to measure due to the hardness of the soil. The tracks weren't deep enough to cast, and further investigation didn't reveal any more tracks along the creature's path into the woods. I've told this story to a few coworkers, but mostly it's been met with doubt and skepticism. Regardless, my son and I have no doubt about what we saw that night. After that encounter, we never saw it again, but we did hear some wood knocks and strange noises coming from the woods. It was definitely an interesting experience. One crisp fall day in Marshall County, Tennessee, near Lewisburg, I was working with a couple of my horses by the barn when I noticed the rest of the herd in the field staring into the woods. They were only about 100 feet from the edge of the woods. At first, I figured they were watching a dog or a deer. As I continued to work, I kept glancing in the direction they were looking and saw what I thought was a teenager standing at the tree line. This got me a bit irritated, thinking someone was trespassing and getting too close to my horses. I took another look and saw that the kid appeared to be wearing a very thick coat, which struck me as odd since the temperature was around 45 to 50 degrees that day. The creature from head to knees looked like it was wearing a light gray parka, but I couldn't see below the knees. At first I wasn't scared, just thought it was a boy, but the longer I looked, the stranger it seemed. This figure stood on two legs and started swaying back and forth. As it swayed, I noticed that the hair was longer than I originally thought, and the swinging motion was not human-like at all. My mind raced to try to figure out what I was seeing. Was it a boy? I wasn't sure. The idea of it being a Bigfoot or Sasquatch didn't even cross my mind at that moment. The whole encounter only lasted about 10 to 15 seconds. I turned my attention back to the horse for a moment, and when I looked back, it was gone. I was left puzzled because I didn't know much about Bigfoot and had zero information on it. Later that week, while at work, I mentioned what I saw to some coworkers who had lived in the area their whole lives. One of them, a hunter, told me he had sightings about 20 miles from where I saw the creature. He said the ones he'd seen were usually dark brown or black, but what I saw was a very light gray. Ever since that day, when I'm working with the horses, I make sure to carry a small camera with a zoom lens, hoping that if I ever see it again, I can capture it on film. In the winter of 2004, down in Blount County, Tennessee, just south of Maryville, I had an encounter that I'll never forget. It was an unusually warm day in mid-December, and my buddy and I were out hunting in this area called Chilhowie. The sun was about an hour away from setting when we decided to climb down from our deer stands. We met up in a little holler about 100 yards from our tree stands and started walking back to the four-wheeler. That's when we heard this very low rumble coming from the holler we'd just come from. We were about 35 yards away from it, almost at the edge of a field, so we decided to sit really still for a bit to see if we could hear anything more. At that moment, we thought it was just a deer we'd spooked, maybe letting out a grunt or a huff. After a while, we got up and continued walking, probably another 10 minutes or so, when we heard a loud splash coming from a small drinking hole nearby. My buddy and I looked at each other, both of us thinking the same thing. What the hell is that? We kept on walking slowly, hoping to still catch sight of a deer, but then we heard a second splash. That's when it really hit us. This wasn't a deer. We moved forward another 20 yards or so, and then saw something that stopped us in our tracks. Standing there, about 7 to 8 feet tall and weighing roughly 300 to 350 pounds, was what looked like a Bigfoot. My buddy and I were completely stunned. The creature saw us but didn't seem to care much that we were there. It just lingered around for a minute before it wandered off toward a small ridge and disappeared from our sight. We were too terrified to follow it, so we made a beeline back to the house. When we got back, we told everyone what we saw, but they all said we were crazy, insisting it was just a bear. But I've been hunting bears for years. I know how they move. This was absolutely not a bear. Bears drop down to all fours. I watched this thing walk on its hind legs for at least 30 to 40 yards. It looked like some kind of human-ape hybrid. I'm 100% sure it was a Bigfoot, and so was my buddy. It's something neither of us will ever forget. It was July 2007 in Gibson County, Tennessee, near the town of Kenton. I was visiting my grandparents' farm, which they still live on today. At the time, I was about 12 years old and visited there almost weekly. Being summer, my grandparents would allow my sister, who was 10 at the time, and me to have sleepovers at their house. There were probably 7 of us staying over that night. My grandparents' farm is situated between 2 small towns, each with a population of around 1,000. It's also about 10 minutes away from 3 different wildlife areas. Back then, they had no neighbors, just cows and cornfields all around. Around 11 p.m., We decided to go outside because we were being too loud and my grandparents had gone to bed. This wasn't the first time. We'd done this probably half a dozen times over the course of the summer. We had only been outside for around 30 minutes to an hour when we started hearing odd noises from the cornfield across the road, the sound of corn stalks breaking, to be precise. This continued for the next 20 to 30 minutes. Since we were just a bunch of kids playing outside, we ignored the sounds and kept talking. Suddenly, we noticed the three dogs sitting on the front porch had their tails tucked between their legs and were growling at something in the cornfield. The field was only about 50 yards from where we were sitting in my grandparents' front yard. Out of nowhere, we heard a loud scream from the cornfield. Then, something emerged from the field right in front of us. What we saw was a tall, human-like creature covered in dark brown hair. It was slightly taller than the corn, which stood at least 6 to 7 feet tall at that time. We took one look at the creature and bolted back to the house as fast as we could, leaving all our things outside. Once we got inside, we stared at each other in shock, trying to process what we had just seen. None of us wanted to tell our grandparents because we thought they'd think we were crazy. Of the 7 of us who saw the creature, 4 had been raised hunting and fishing. We knew the animals native to our area and spent countless hours in the woods with our fathers and grandfathers, learning how to track animals and respect nature. To this day, I'm afraid to go outside at their house at night by myself. I've heard the same noises again and again over the years, including the screams and wood knocks. Because of this experience, I still don't like going out into the woods in that area.